Hello everyone, grab a blanket and tuck yourself in for Adventures of Paddington seeing snow for the first time. This would be more appropriate in January for those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, not so much me in Australia, but here we go. This is chapter 5 of book 2 and it's entitled Trouble at number 32. That evening after the bonfire had died away, the weather suddenly became even colder. When Paddington went upstairs to bed, he opened his window a few inches and peeped out in case there were any more fireworks to see. He sniffed the cold night air and then hastily shut the window, diving into bed and pulling the blankets over his ears. In the morning, he woke much earlier than usual, shivering with cold, and found to his surprise that the ends of his whiskers, which had become uncovered during the night, were quite stiff. Having listened for a while to make sure breakfast was being cooked, he put on his duffel coat and went along to the bathroom. When he reached the bathroom, Paddington made several interesting discoveries. First, his flannel, which he'd left folded over the towel rail the night before, was as stiff as a board, and it made a funny crackling sound when he tried to bend it straight. Then, when he turned the tap, nothing happened. Paddington decided quite quickly that he wasn't meant to wash that morning and hurried back to his own room. But when he got there, he had yet another surprise. He drew the curtains and tried to look out of his window, only to find that it was all white and frosted, just like the one in the bathroom. Paddington breathed heavily on the glass and rubbed it with the back of his paw. When he had made a hole big enough to peer through, he almost fell over backwards with astonishment. All traces of the previous evening's bonfire had completely vanished. Instead, everything was covered by a thick blanket of white. Not only that, but there were millions of large white flakes falling out of the sky. He rushed downstairs to tell the others. The Browns were all sitting round the breakfast table when he burst into the dining room. Paddington waved his paws wildly in the air and called for them to look out of the windows. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mr. Brown, looking up from his morning paper. "What is the matter?" "Look," said Paddington, pointing towards the garden. "Everything's gone white." Judy threw back her head and laughed. "It's all right, Paddington. It's only snow. It happens every year." "Snow," said Paddington, looking puzzled. "What's snow?" "It's a nuisance," said Mr. Brown crossly. Mr. Brown wasn't in a very good mood that morning. He hadn't expected the weather to change so quickly, and all the upstairs water pipes had frozen. To make matters worse, everyone had been blaming him because he'd forgotten to stoke the boiler before going to bed. "Snow," said Judy. "Well, it's sort of frozen rain. It's very soft." "Jolly good for snowballs," exclaimed Jonathan. "We'll show you how to make them after breakfast. We can clear the paths at the same time." Paddington sat down at the breakfast table and began undoing his napkin, hardly able to take his eyes off the scene outside the window. "Paddington," said Mrs. Brown suspiciously, "did you wear your duffel coat when you washed this morning?" "A lick and a promise," said Mrs. Bird as she handed him a steaming bowl of porridge, "and more promise than lick, if you ask me." But Paddington was much too busy thinking about the snow to hear what they were saying. He was wondering if he could speed up the breakfast by having all his things on one plate. But just as he reached for the bacon and eggs and the marmalade, he caught Mrs. Bird's eye and hurriedly pretended he was only conducting to the music on the wireless. "If you do go out after breakfast, Paddington," said Mrs. Brown, "I think it would be nice if you could clear Mr. Curry's path for him before you do ours. We all know it wasn't your fault about his suit last night, but it would show you mean well." "That's a good idea," exclaimed Jonathan. "We'll give you a hand. Then we can use all the snow we get to build a snowman this afternoon. How about it, Paddington?" Paddington looked rather doubtful. Whenever he tried to do anything for Mr. Curry, something always seemed to go wrong. "But no playing snowballs," warned Mrs. Bird. "Mr. Curry always sleeps with his bedroom window open, even in the middle of winter. If you wake him, he won't like it at all." Paddington, Jonathan, and Judy agreed to be as quiet as they could, and as soon as breakfast was over, they dressed in their warmest clothes and rushed outside to look at the snow. Paddington was very impressed. It was much deeper than he had expected, but not at all as cold as he had thought it would be, except when he stood for very long in one place. Within a few minutes, all three were busy with shovels and brooms, clearing Mr. Curry's paths for him. Jonathan and Judy started on the pavement outside the house. Paddington fetched his seaside bucket and spade and began work on Mr. Curry's back garden path, which was not quite so wide. He filled his bucket with snow and then tipped it through a hole in the Browns' fence, near the place where they intended building a snowman later in the day. It was hard work, for the snow was deep and came right up to the edge of his duffel coat, and as fast as he cleared a space, more snow came down, covering the part he'd just done. After working for what seemed like hours, Paddington decided to have a rest. But no sooner had he settled himself on the bucket than something hit him on the back of the head, nearly knocking his hat off into the bargain. "Caught you!" yelled Jonathan with delight. "Come on, Paddington, make yourself some snowballs. Then we can have a fight." Paddington jumped up from his bucket and dodged round the side of Mr. Curry's shed. Then, after first making sure Mrs. Bird was nowhere in sight, he gathered up some snow and rolled it into a hard ball. Holding it firmly in his right paw, he closed his eyes and took careful aim. "Yah!" shouted Jonathan as Paddington opened his eyes. "Missed me by a mile. You'd better get some practice in." Paddington stood behind Mr. Curry's shed, scratching his head and examining his paw. He knew the snowball must have gone somewhere, but he hadn't the least idea where. After thinking about it for some time, he decided to have another go. If he crept very quietly round the side of the house, he might even be able to catch Jonathan unawares and get his own back. It was as he tiptoed past Mr. Curry's back door, clutching the snowball in his paw, that he noticed for the first time the door was open. The wind was blowing the snow through into the kitchen, and there was already a small pile of it on the mat. Paddington hesitated for a moment and then pulled the door shut. There was a click as it closed, and he carefully tested it with his paw to make certain it was properly fastened. He was sure Mr. Curry wouldn't want snow all over his kitchen floor, and he felt very pleased at being able to do another good deed, apart from sweeping the path. To Paddington's surprise, when he peered round the corner at the front of the house, Mr. Curry was already there. He was wearing a dressing gown over his pyjamas, and he looked cold and cross. He broke off his conversation with Jonathan and Judy and stared in Paddington's direction. "Ah, there you are, Bear," he exclaimed. "Have you been throwing snowballs?" "Snowballs?" repeated Paddington, hurriedly putting his paw behind his back. "Did you say snowballs, Mr. Curry?" "Yes," said Mr. Curry, "snowballs. A large one came through my bedroom window a moment ago and landed right in the middle of my bed. Now it's all melted on my hot water bottle. If I thought you had done it on purpose, Bear—" "Oh, no, Mr. Curry," said Paddington earnestly. "I wouldn't do a thing like that on purpose. I don't think I could. It's difficult throwing snowballs by paw, especially big ones like that." "Like what?" asked Mr. Curry suspiciously. "Like the one you said landed in your bed," said Paddington, sounding rather confused. He was beginning to wish Mr. Curry would hurry up and go. The snowball was making his paw very cold. Said Mr. Curry. "Well, I'm not standing out here in the snow discussing Bear's pranks. I came downstairs intending to tell you off." He looked around approvingly at the clean pavement. "But I must admit, I've been pleasantly surprised. In fact," he turned to go back indoors, "if you make as good a job of the rest, I might even give you 10 pence. Between you," he added, in case they mistook his meaning. 10 pence, exclaimed Jonathan disgustedly. "One measly 10-penny pence." "Oh, well," said Judy, "at least we've done our good deed for the day. It should last for a while, even with Mr. Curry." Paddington looked doubtful. "I don't think it'll last very long," he said, listening hard. "In fact, I think it's nearly over." Even as he spoke, there came a roar of rage from Mr. Curry, followed by several loud bangs. "Whatever's up now?" exclaimed Judy. "That sounds like Mr. Curry banging on his back door." "I thought I was doing him a good turn," said Paddington, looking very worried, "so I shut it. I think he must be looked out." "Oh, gosh, Paddington," groaned Judy, "you are an unlucky bear today." "Who shut my door?" roared Mr. Curry as he strode round to the front again. "Who locked me out of my house? Bear!" he barked. "Where are you, Bear?" Mr. Curry glared down the road, but there was not a soul in sight. If he had been a little less cross, he might have noticed 3 distinct sets of paw prints and footprints where Paddington, Jonathan, and Judy had beaten a hasty retreat. After a distance, the 3 tracks separated. Jonathan's and Judy's disappeared into the Browns' house. Paddington's went towards the market. He had seen quite enough of Mr. Curry for one day. Besides, it had gone 10:30, and he had promised to meet Mr. Gruber for morning cocoa at 11. "I really think Mr. Curry has gone a bit funny in the head," said Mrs. Brown later that day. "He was standing outside the house in his pyjamas and dressing gown this morning, in all that snow. Then he started running around in circles, waving his fist." Replied Mrs. Bird. "I saw Paddington playing snowballs in his back garden just before that happened." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. She looked out of the window. The sky had cleared at last in the garden, with all the trees bowed down under the weight of the snow, looking just like a Christmas card. "It seems very still," she said, "almost as if something was about to happen." Mrs. Bird followed her gaze. "They've made a wonderful snowman. I've never seen quite such a good one like this before. It's only small, but it looks most lifelike." "Isn't that Paddington's old hat they've put on top?" asked Mrs. Brown. She looked round as the door opened and Jonathan and Judy entered the room. "We were just saying," she continued, "what a lovely snowman you've made." "It isn't a snowman," said Jonathan mysteriously. "It's a snow bear. It's meant to be a surprise for Dad. He's coming down the road now." "It looks as if he'll have more than one surprise coming his way," said Mrs. Bird. "I can see Mr. Curry waiting for him by the fence." "Oh, crikey," groaned Jonathan. "That's torn it." "Trust Mr. Curry to spoil things," said Judy. "I hope he doesn't keep Dad talking too long." "Why, dear," said Mrs. Brown, "does it matter?" "Does it matter?" cried Jonathan, rushing to the window. "I'll say it does." Mrs. Brown didn't pursue the subject. She had no doubt she would hear all about it in due course, whatever it was. It took Mr. Brown a long time to get rid of Mr. Curry and put his car away in the garage. When he did come indoors, he looked very fed up. "That Mr. Curry," exclaimed, telling tales about Paddington again. "If I'd been there this morning, he'd have got more than a snowball in his bed." He looked around the room. "By the way, where is Paddington?" Paddington usually liked helping Mr. Brown put his car away, and it was most unusual for him not to be there, ready to give poor signals. "I haven't seen him for ages," said Mrs. Brown. She looked at Jonathan and Judy. "Do you know where he is?" "Didn't he jump out at you, Dad?" asked Jonathan. "Jump out at me?" exclaimed Mr. Brown, looking puzzled. "Not that I know of. Why, was he supposed to?" "But you saw the snow bear, didn't you?" asked Judy. "By the garage?" "Snow bear?" said Mr. Brown. "Good heavens, you don't mean that wasn't Paddington?" "What's that young bear been up to now?" asked Mrs. Bird. "Do you mean to say he's been out there covered in snow all this time? I've never heard of such a thing." "Well, it wasn't really his idea," said Jonathan. "Not all of it." "I expect he heard Mr. Curry's voice and got frightened," said Judy. "Just you bring him indoors at once," said Mrs. Bird. "Why, he might catch his death of cold. I've a good mind to send it to bed without any supper." It wasn't that Mrs. Bird was cross with Paddington. She was simply worried in case anything happened to him, and when he came through the door, her manner changed at once. She took one of his paws in her hand and then felt his nose. "Good gracious!" she exclaimed. "He's like an iceberg." Paddington shivered. "I don't think I like being a snow bear very much," he said in a weak voice. "I should think not, indeed!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. She turned to the others. "That bear's got to go to bed at once, with a hot water bottle and a bowl of broth. Then I'm sending for the doctor." With that, she made Paddington sit by the fire while she hurried upstairs to fetch a thermometer. Paddington lay back in Mr. Brown's armchair with his eyes closed. He certainly felt very strange. He couldn't remember ever having felt like it before. One moment he seemed to be as cold as the snow outside. The next he felt as if he was on fire. He wasn't quite sure how long he lay there, but he vaguely remembered Mrs. Bird sticking something long and cold under his tongue, which she told him not to bite. After that, he didn't remember much more, except that everyone started running around preparing soup and filling hot water bottles and generally making sure his room was comfortable for him. Within a few moments, everything was ready, and the Browns all trooped upstairs to make sure he was properly tucked in bed. Paddington thanked them all very much, and then, after waving a paw limply in their direction, lay back and closed his eyes. "He must be feeling bad," whispered Mrs. Bird. "He hasn't even touched his soup." "Gosh," said Jonathan miserably as he followed Judy down the stairs. "It was mostly my idea. I shall never forgive myself if anything happens to him." "It was my idea as well," said Judy comfortingly. "I expect we all thought of it together. Anyway," she added as the front door bell rang, "that must be the doctor, so we shall know soon." Dr. McAndrew was a long time with Paddington, and when he came downstairs again, he looked very serious. "How is he, Doctor?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "He's not seriously ill, is he?" "Aye, he is," said Dr. McAndrew. "You may as well know. That young bear's very ill indeed. Playing in the snow when he's not used to, no doubt. I've given him a wee drop of medicine to tide him over the night, and I'll be along first thing in the morning." "But he is going to be all right, isn't he, Dr. McAndrew?" cried Judy. Dr. McAndrew shook his head gravely. "I wouldn't care to give an opinion," he said. "I wouldn't care to give an opinion at all." With that he bade them all good night and drove away. It was a very sad party of Browns that went upstairs that evening. While they were getting ready for bed, Mrs. Bird quietly moved her things into Paddington's room so that she could keep an eye on him during the night. But she wasn't the only one who couldn't think of sleep. Several times the door to Paddington's room gently opened, and either Mr. or Mrs. Brown or Judy and Jonathan crept in to see how he was getting on. Somehow it didn't seem possible that anything could happen to Paddington, but every time they looked at Mrs. Bird, she just shook her head and went on with her sewing so that they couldn't see her face. The next day, the news of Paddington's illness quickly spread around their neighbourhood, and by lunchtime there was a steady stream of callers asking after him. Mr. Gruber was the first one on the scene. "I wondered what had happened to young Mr. Brown when he didn't turn up for 11sies this morning," he said, looking very upset. "I kept his cocoa hot for over an hour." Mr. Gruber went away again, but returned shortly afterwards carrying a bunch of grapes and a large basket of fruit and flowers from the rest of the traders in the Portobello market. "I'm afraid there isn't much about it this time of year," he said apologetically, "but we've done the best we can." He paused at the door. "I'm sure he'll be all right, Mrs. Brown," he said. "With so many people wanting him to get well, I'm sure he will." Mr. Gruber raised his hat to Mrs. Brown and then began walking slowly in the direction of the park. Somehow he didn't want to go back to his shop that day. Even Mr. Curry knocked on the door that afternoon and brought with him an apple and a jar of calves' foot jelly, which he said was very good for invalids. Mrs. Bird took all the presents up to Paddington's room and placed them carefully beside his bed in case he should wake up and want something to eat. Dr. McAndrew called a number of times during the next 2 days, but despite everything he did, there seemed to be no change at all. "We'll just have to bide our time," was all he would say. It was 3 days later, at breakfast time, that the door to the Browns' dining room burst open and Mrs. Bird rushed in. "Oh, do come quickly," she cried. "It's Paddington." Everyone jumped up from the table and stared at Mrs. Bird. He's not worse, is he?" asked Mrs. Brown, voicing the thoughts of them all. "Mercy me, no," said Mrs. Bird, fanning herself with the morning paper. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. He's much better. He's sitting up in bed asking for a marmalade sandwich." "A marmalade sandwich!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Oh, thank goodness!" She wasn't quite sure whether she wanted to laugh or cry. I never knew hearing the word marmalade could make me feel so happy." Just as she spoke, there was a loud ring from the bell, which Mr. Brown had installed by the side of Paddington's bed in case of emergency. "Oh dear!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "I hope I haven't spoken too soon." She rushed out of the room, and everyone followed her up the stairs to Paddington's room. When they entered, Paddington was lying on his back with his paws in the air, staring up at the ceiling. "Paddington," called Mrs. Brown, hardly daring to breathe. "Paddington, are you all right?" Everyone listened anxiously for the reply. "I think I've had a bit of a relapse," said Paddington in a weak voice. "I think I'd better have 2 marmalade sandwiches, just to make sure." There was a sigh of relief from the Browns and Mrs. Bird as they exchanged glances. Even if he wasn't quite himself yet, Paddington was definitely on the road to recovery.